Sean, Wiswesser is a former CIA senior operations officer who served multiple overseas tours, including war zone service, and held senior leadership roles, including chief of station and joint deputy assignments across the US intelligence community. His work argues that Russian intelligence is not a side instrument of Putin's state, but one of the state's central operating systems. He believes that the West treated the post-Cold War intelligence confrontation as largely over, while Moscow never did. Russian intelligence services continued to see the United States as the main enemy operationally and psychologically, is his claim. Well, we're going to get into more detail about the topics he covers, and he's got an absolutely fantastic book out. We'll start with that. We'll put a link in the description. Please do get it, because it is one, I would say, of the best works and most successful works on this topic. Sean, welcome to the channel.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Honor to be with you and your listeners. Appreciate that endorsement of the book. It means a lot for me. You do quality reporting. I respect your podcast and everything that you do. So it's an honor. Thanks for having me.
It's fabulous. What I loved about the book is actually it's got lots of operational examples. So it's not the usual think tank, this is what Russia thinks in theory, etc., etc. This is how Putin operates. A lot of that stuff feels very conjectural and distant. You've got down into the dirty detail. You've spoken to numerous KGB officers. You have handled them at various times. How important do you think is that practical case experience in the book to distinguish it from all the others out there?
Yeah, I think it's what makes it unique. A lot of the advanced readers. I'm fortunate to have some very senior endorsements from the intelligence community, including 2 former deputy directors of CIA that endorsed the book. And Jennifer Eubank was one of them. She's former deputy director of CIA for digital innovation. And she commented on that with her endorsement. She said, the real life examples is what makes the book unique. And so I was glad that I was able to bring my analysis, my 3 decades of intelligence community experience to bear, and that CIA also helps me to clear a lot of practical examples from my career, Russian intelligence services officers that I worked with, and was able to draw on their experience, because no better spokespersons for the malign work of their services, Jonathan, than them themselves. I quote them throughout the book as, here's what they say. Here's what they say about their own services, about just how central the Chekisti are, as they call themselves, the Chekists are to Putin's Russia today. So, yeah, thank you.
This has been a sort of, a gateway or for me, a way to try and understand some of this psychology, which now, of course, has become, centrally enshrined to the state. We'll come to that. How important would you say things like the Mitrokhin archive and Bizmenov, who is frequently quoted, how much do we know from dissidents, and does your work with, working directly with agents corroborate some of this sort of dissident analysis that we've got describing the psychology and operational details?
Yeah, Jonathan, you mentioned Mitrokhin, and I had the honor, you and I met in Oxford. Thank you again for coming to my talk there, and the Emerging Threats Group. Well, right before that, I was at Cambridge, had the privilege of meeting Dr. Chris Andrew, who's done really seminal work in intelligence history and on the KGB. And of course, he had the book, The Sword and the Shield, with Vasily Mitrokhin. I reference Mitrokhin throughout my book because, of course, Gordon Carrera also has that excellent work that's just out now. I'm just finishing up myself. Mitrokhin called the KGB and the Chekism within society and its influence the beast. It was the beast he was trying to destroy. That was his mission. In a similar way, my book is a mission to expose, disrupt, and destroy as much as possible the operations and malign work of the Russian intelligence services. I consider them one of the greatest threats to democracy around the world, along with their Chinese allies. So I think that, unfortunately, Jonathan, over the past 20 years, while the West, we were engaged against another existential threat, radical Islamic extremism, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Russia got a pass for the most part. I mentioned, if you look at our national security strategy for the past 20 years, the unclassified versions, Russia was barely top 10. Russia was mentioned, but not as a critical threat. Well, we're seeing the results of that now, of Putin getting a pass and not being in the limelight. We're seeing what he did with that. He chose to to refine and continue to advance hybrid war against the West, what they call new generation warfare. And we're seeing the ultimate result of that play out with Ukraine when there was no stop to the escalation, when Putin continued his aggression in Georgia, Syria, Ukraine. In 2022, he ultimately decided, you know what? Nobody's going to stop me. I'll just take the whole damn country. I'll just take all of Ukraine. And what did we do in the West to really stop that escalation? So I think it's a continuum, Jonathan. And we've been warned. Those figures like Mitrokhin and others in history tried to warn us about this, what was coming, and I don't think we paid enough attention.
And this really sort of triggers a kind of memory that has repeated, not got a huge amount of attention. And we've heard Peskov say it, we've heard Putin himself say it, that if we are not feared, we do not exist. And I think there's an underlying, actually, you're really well placed to say, well, how far is this a philosophy that's taken from the intelligence services themselves? But the idea that the existential threat to Russia is not a threat to its borders, is not, the sort of threats that we think it is, but is simply if they are not feared by their neighbors and globally, then there's no reason for their existence to continue.
Yeah, Jonathan, I think the fear, the terror of the state and its security organizations, that's the organizing principle. Let's look at symbolism. Symbols are important. Putin just resurrected the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky at the FSB Academy last month. Now the FSB Academy in the name of Dzerzhinsky, and his statue went up. With the fall of the Soviet Union, remember, Dzerzhinsky's statue was taken down from Lubyanka Square. Lubyanka, that horrible symbol and incarnation, really, of Soviet imperialism, terrorism against their own people. Lubyanka, where the FSB headquarters still are located today. But Dzerzhinsky's statue, that was too much for that attempt at democracy. Gorbachev and then Yeltsin, there was this time period in the 90s when there was a lot of hope. The winds of change were blowing. Well, now Putin, I think, has said, he feels comfortable enough that he can put Dzerzhinsky's statue back up. What does Dzerzhinsky stand for? His quote, of course, was, "We stand for organized terror." Carried out the Red Terror, 1918 and 1922. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet people killed by Dzerzhinsky under Lenin's orders, under all the revolutionaries, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin. They all believed in it. Have to have terror. So terror was an organizing principle of the Soviet state. It's something that when Putin calls himself a Chekist and he reveres the Chekist traditions of the Cheka, that first committee for the defense of the revolution, Cheka being the abbreviated letters, Cheka in Russian. So he's a Chekist. Putin's an avowed Chekist. He's proud of it. All those Siloviki that surround him, all KGB hardliners, and we can talk more about them. That's what they stand for. It's terror at home. It's the people living in fear. And then it's extorting that terror, that coercion abroad. Who can argue, looking back at the 25 years plus of Putin's foreign policy, that it hasn't been about terror, intimidation, and coercion? And we see that playing out in Europe now, Jonathan. We see that with hybrid war. We see how they're using extortion as state policy.
And I think your point here is not internalized enough. No, we have John McCain, saying that Russia is basically a gas station with a country attached. But actually, I think your interpretation is a little more refined here. Yeah, the gas station part is the fuel for this, but actually, what we have is an intelligence service with a country attached, and one that possibly fused with its mafia class. So how far do you think the intelligence services became the ruling class?
Well, I call them thugocracy. That's the term I'm using more and more, Jonathan. I don't know any other better way to put it. I've mentioned in many media appearances, I was in The Sun this past week for the second time talking about this coercive, extortive policy of Russia. They are a mafia-like culture, the security services, and they're the ones ruling the roost in Russia for 26 years. I have a column piece coming out in the next week where I refer to Putin's state today. It's a thugocracy. It's using things like attempted assassinations, whether they succeed or not, Jonathan. For the Russians, they're a win. Look at their targeting of the CEO of Rheinmetall a year plus ago. GRU, Unit 29155. Even though they didn't succeed, now the Germans have to keep that CEO under state protection, probably forever, right? They know that there was a state plot to kill him. They've carried out other assassinations in Germany, like The FSB assassin Krasikov, who was traded back to Russia in 2024 in that latest giant spy swap. Putin greeted him at the tarmac, big handshake and bear hug for his former bodyguard. What else do we call this? This is a thugocracy, a president meeting an assassin on the tarmac. Not just meeting him, Putin insisted that that trade swap would not happen without Krasikov. He wanted to show his thugocracy. He wanted to show those security service in Siloviki. You murder for me, I'm going to get you back. I'm going to take care of you. And so I think that it's hard for us, Jonathan, as democracies. We can't possibly imagine that. We want to give Putin the pass. We want to say, oh, geez, surely he must not have known. Surely he must not be aware. He is aware. He is ordering it. He is fostering a culture in his security services where this is accepted, where they're trying to outdo themselves with their level of recklessness in Europe. You know, in the days of the Cold War, Jonathan, we never saw that. We never saw the targeting of a CEO abroad, and we wouldn't have stood for it. Look at the other plot that I referred to. Outrageous that it hasn't gotten more attention. The GRU putting explosives on planes. This was reported on in 2024 by the New York Times and other media outlets. The plane that exploded at a Lithuanian airport, the Lithuanians attributed to the GRU. My God, what would we have done in the 1980s if President Reagan had found out that the KGB or the GRU had put explosives on planes or put packages on the other part of the plot? They were tracking packages to the United States to see if they could put explosives later. Missiles would have been flying, Jonathan, I can tell you. The proxy wars of the Cold War were meant to show the other side we won't tolerate escalation. And we kept each other in check, right? Right now we have unchecked escalation. We have Putin getting away with whatever he deems is appropriate for him to hit back against the West for support to Ukraine. It's really outrageous. It's outrageous.
We had a satirical artist, not necessarily a friend of Ukraine, but certainly an opponent of the regime. We had a satirical artist murdered in Poland last week.
Yep, Poland, yeah.
That almost certainly has either the imprint of the intelligence services or perhaps in Chechens, but nonetheless, it's perhaps part of the same ecosystem. Nonetheless, we had property and vehicles of the outgoing British Prime Minister targeted by almost certainly, outsourced agents of the Russian state. And that was as much admitted in a court case last week. Again, during the Cold War, it seems that they would not have been so brazen. And as you say, there would have been some response to that.
Well, who's keeping them in check now? That's the problem. There are no bounds to what the Russian intelligence services are willing to try, Jonathan, because in the days of the KGB, at least during the Soviet Union, they were the sword and shield of the Communist Party. They answered to the party. They answered to the Politburo. Andrei Soldatov said recently in a testimony, I believe they're in the UK, I agree with him. He said, people look for illusions. Putin's Russia. They look back to the 80s or 70s when Andropov, former chair of the KGB, when he became the head of the Politburo, the general secretary. No. Soldatov said something very wise, I think. He said, no, we really should be looking at the 1950s. We really should be looking at the example when Stalin had total autocracy. He was the boss. That's the terminology I point out frequently. And in my book, the Russian intelligence services, they call Putin chef. Back then in the day, in the 50s, Stalin's term, they called him khozyain. They called him sort of the head, the big man, the boss. They call Putin the chef in a similar vein. And he has absolute power, absolute control. And so there is nobody keeping a watch on the services. There's no one to say, hey, that one targeting, corporate leaders now, or, cutting cables in the Baltic Sea. Do we really want to do that? No, I think they're being creative. I think that the boss has sent down the word to his services. Come up with ideas. Come up with creative solutions. I want you to hit back for support to Ukraine. And then the other part of it is when that escalation is not checked by the West, when we don't have a response, when there's no consequence, then it continues. I want to mention just briefly that your prime minister's the targeting the arson. I had a piece, I was quoted in the Sun piece. What I said in my interview, the Sun quoted me a little bit liberally. I don't mind that they did, but what I was trying to say to
They're creative with the headline, were they?
Yes. If you look at the video interview, though, what I was trying to say is, when are we in the West going to answer this hybrid war, which is a form of warfare, of course? And we're afraid to use the term, aren't we? We're afraid in the West to even use the term. Everybody's afraid of escalation. But you can't be afraid of escalation only on one side. While the other side continues to escalate, while they continue to go unbounded, I'm confident that your security services and your police are going to get to the bottom of this, they already have. The BBC reporting conclusively points to Russian state involvement. So again, what's the consequence going to be, though? Investigating and improving is one thing, but if there's no consequence, if we don't hit back, then Russia will continue. The easiest solution where to hit back is there is a kinetic war happening right now. Ukraine is fighting for its life. Ukraine is fighting for their very existence. We can be doing more. We in the West, not just the United States, not just Europe. We collectively can be doing more to hit back, and that's where it would make a difference to Putin.
And a strongly worded letter is not going to cut it, which seems to be the Western response over the last 4 years or so. Now, this is, I think, an interesting point where I think a lot of Western analysis is based on hope and misunderstanding. So when we talk about internal checks and balances on Putin, when we talk about resistance to his regime, often things like the army are cited, the oligarch class, etc. But I think based on your analysis, that really is misinterpreting the structure of the system. This is a system fully captured by an inner core of the intelligence services. And actually, these other entities, I think by your analysis, do not have that much authority within the system.
Yeah, within the system, this is a really important point. We talked about this at Oxford, Jonathan, and at my talk at Cambridge. The Siloviki in charge. Putin is in charge. The military are enablers under him. That's really hard for the West to understand. I listened to our military analysis analysts. Some of them are very, very good in the Ukraine war. They never mention the intelligence services. You don't ever hear them talking about the FSB or GRU. Chapter 10 of my book, I lay out the case, and I'm convinced over time it will only be more and more evident. We won't know the history until there's a change in Russia, and we have some of these intelligence veterans that will confirm all of it. But I believe no one was more responsible for the Ukraine war in 2022, the invasion, than the FSB. It was their operational analytical department, their fifth service that provides briefings to the president every day. They are the ones that control the intelligence to him. They're the ones that enabled him and led Putin to believe he could win that war. The military service, the military under the armed forces of the Russian Federation, under Putin, these are enablers. They do what they're told. I've given this example many times. I've spoken on it. It's in my book. Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, has the same exact rank as Valery Gerasimov, the chief of staff of the Russian military. And Gerasimov's pointed to as, he's the one running the Ukraine war. Bortnikov's never served a single day in the military, and yet he holds the same rank. Why is that? Putin wants to make it clear, hey, these are my guys, okay? They don't answer to anyone. If anyone believes when an inner collegium of those Siloviki, those ruling leaders, of the type that, if you remember in 2022, about a week before the war started, there was that key meeting of the national security kind of leadership. It was all the Siloviki. Gerasimov was president, the heads of the services, Naryshkin, head of the SVR, Bortnikov, head of the FSB. And Putin made all of them go around the table, and Matvienko too, other leadership. He wanted everybody to agree that essentially he was laying out the case for war, but he used the 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine. He was talking about them. Why was that important? He wanted them all to state on the record they were with him. And you remember when Naryshkin, head of the SVR, was a little too mealy-mouthed? That's when Putin, of course, said, hey Sergei, speak plainly. What's the problem? Cat got your tongue? Speak up. Are you for it or not? He's making the point. I'm the boss man. I'm calling the shots. Everybody is in this with me. And so look at who was in the room for that meeting. Overwhelmingly, it was the Siloviki. It was those old KGB hardliners, Patrushev, Ivanov, Syechin, head of Rosneft, another one of the Siloviki, Zolotov, head of Rosgvardia, the 300,000 troops most loyal to Putin, which is why I always say the Prigozhin mutiny had absolutely no chance, because he didn't come up against Rosgvardia or any of those units in Moscow. So again, they're calling the shots, Jonathan, and it's a serious deficiency in our analysis from the West that we don't focus on the all-encompassing, all-controlling chokehold that the Russian intelligence services have on their people, on the military, on all the other organs of power in Russia.
And this misses the other point.
We don't quite get, yeah.
Yeah, we don't. This misses the other point, this eternal debate about Putin or the people. And of course, Jade McGlynn, I think very correctly, titled the book Russia's War, in that it's more than just Putin who are culpable for it. But this is, I think, where a lot of the analysis falls down. And I've got this phrase here, everyone looks at Putin and they look at his potential fall as resolving all of these problems. But if he is simply representative of a class, the boss man amongst an actual sort of cult or class, or as I put it here, primus inter Czechistas, then actually his demise is not going to solve the problem because you've got a whole group of people who actually are aligned on a similar worldview and similar ambition.
I like that term, by the way, Jonathan. Kudos, primus Czechistas. I like
But
that.
if you use that, if that goes in the
Yes, it
textbooks,
is.
then
It's a
do it.
species. It's a particular species of Russian power right now. No, you're right. Listen, this is why I had a piece in Foreign Policy magazine last month. I said, don't believe the rumors about Putin's weakness. And I was honored they published that piece in Foreign Policy because it was to counter all of this nonsense coming out. And it really is nonsense. A lot of reporters, a lot of very smart people saying, oh, Putin's vulnerable right now. He's vulnerable like he's never been before. These are not people that understand the Russian intelligence services and the layered security state Putin has set up for the past 26 years. He's really good at this, Jonathan. He knows how to hold on to power. He knows how to organize the state around him as the organizing principle. The FSB's primary role is protection of Vladimir Putin and his role in controlling the state. It's not about counterterrorism. It's not about counterintelligence, even corruption. All those things are secondary. And this is what I lay out in my book. And I quote intelligence officers that said it. You look at somebody like Sergei Tretyakov, deputy chief resident of the SVR in New York. It's in his book with Pete Early, Comrade J. I had the honor to debrief, meet him, and talk about it. He said, listen, that's why he worked with us. That's why he defected. He said, listen, you can't. He saw it early on, too, when Putin just was coming to power. We can't change this. State's gone. We're leaving any hope of democracy in the past. And this was back around 2000 when he got out and when he was working with us and he laid out his case. It's only gotten worse since then, Jonathan. So, yeah, I think it's there's a tendency, even when we look at Putin and the regime, there's a tendency among even our intelligence services, some that's leaked reporting in Europe. Oh, he's vulnerable. There could be coup rumors. Doesn't that serve some of the intelligence services pointing it out, right? It makes them look good to their leadership. Oh, our people in our service are saying that he's vulnerable. I worked 30 years in intelligence. I know how it works. But it's nonsense. It's nonsensical. It's not based in reality of how Russia's organized today.
It's a great way of securing and fixing your budget when there's a bun fight over money. But I think to look at this, to understand where we've got now, we'll turn to the war and some of the internal structures that have led to the poor information. But first of all, let's go back to the roots of it, because you said he's been in control for 26 years. The impression I get from when I was in St. Petersburg, 96, 97, was that this process was already taking place. The FSB was taking over the commanding heights, was fusing with the Tambovskaya Grupirovka. Sobchak's office was a convenient cover for these kind of operations. And then fast forward to 2000, we have what looks actually in hindsight to be a declaration of victory. This is, or 1999 rather, December, Putin's speech apparently in the Lubyanka saying mission accomplished. A small group of FSB agents or KGB agents have succeeded in their mission to take control of the state. How far back do we have to go to see the point where the Siloviki started to reassert control after the early 90s when it was a pretty bleak period, I think, for them in the early years of Glasnost, etc.?
Yeah, Jonathan, you and I shared some of that time. I was there in the early to mid 90s. I was in Russia a lot. I was a student. I was doing research. I'd love to think what the FSB thinks of it. Now, I've joked with some FSB officers about that. In liaison, I met officially. I would rub their nose in a little bit. I travel extensively in your country, but I was really just a student back then. They can't believe it. But I remember that time. There was a lot of hope. There was some optimism. The Russian youth of the time were fond of the Scorpions song by the Scorpions, Winds of Change. That was kind of their song of their kind of revolution. But Putin quashed all of that. And the compromise, here's how I like to put it, Jonathan. Yeltsin compromised. Yeltsin did some great things for democracy. He was also incredibly corrupt. So was his family, not just his actual family, but the larger Yeltsin family, the oligarchs that supported him. What was his compromise? His compromise, Yeltsin, as he was leaving power, as he couldn't really rule anymore, couldn't be in politics, his health was deteriorating. Yeltsin thought, you know what? I'm going to take this unknown, this guy who was my FSB director. he's kind of short and not really imposing, and we can control him. We got him, So he thought his oligarchs, Berezovsky and Khodorkovsky and others, we're going to control this guy. And then the compromise was, if we have to sacrifice a little bit of freedoms, okay, but we're going to take care of ourselves, make sure nobody puts me up for trial or my daughter or my family. And Putin, boy, he had them all outsmarted, didn't he? He knew. He was director of the FSB. He knew what he could do. He knew he knew the controls that he could put on society. He knew whose pockets were lined with what. Period of the 1990s, Jonathan, I get into this some in my book, but I'd have to write a whole nother book to detail it. Catherine Belton in Putin's People, she talks about this. Those Siloviki in the 1990s, when companies were being bought for a dime on the dollar or a penny on the dollar, state corporations and otherwise, the FSB and the other security services, they were deeply embedded. They were buying companies. They were embedded to Russian companies. They were using the excuse, we need them for prikritia in Russian. We knew that we need them for krisha, cover. We need them for our foreign operations. And so they were deeply embedded with these companies. And that continues to this day. I always make the point, the FSB is a monolith corporation embedded with companies and vast corporations across Russia where they have their people and they have their influence. But that all started in the early 90s, mid-90s. Putin was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. What was his role? He was in charge of the relations with foreigners and foreign investment. I know some embassy people that dealt with him. They said even then, by the way, he hated the consulate. He was not friendly at all to American diplomats. It was telling early in his career. He tolerated them. His meetings, he would tolerate dealing with Americans. But so then what happened? So they consolidated their control. I think 2008 was a good measure too. Around that time period, Jonathan, that's when he started to feel comfortable enough to test that new generation warfare, hybrid war, continual second front, escalation against the West that we see playing out to this very day. It's when he, of course, decided to invade Georgia in 2008.
And, that we have the 2007 speech where I guess you went from internal consolidation. First of all, you've got the commanding heights of the economy. You've got FSB agents placed in every large company, corporation, etc. As you've just said, probably with a stake in them, financial stake too. But what happens between 2000 and 2007, where he goes from maybe being more internally focused on, consolidating power, to 2007, where he starts to look outward?
I think it's a classic Russian use of Kompromat, It's organizing principle two of their intelligence work is compromising material operations, Russians call it. Goes back to the KGB and even before that, even in the Tsarist days. And so I think that the FSB under Putin in the 90s, when he was director, they were very good at getting the goods. They knew how to control and influence. Look at politicians that used to matter in Russia, that in that period of when Putin came into power in the early 2000s, they didn't matter anymore. Zyuganov, Zhirinovsky, all of these used to be viable opposition to Yeltsin at one point. All of a sudden, they were sort of all bought into Putin's Russia. They're not real opposition parties. They're just all part of the collective, to this day and throughout the past, 20, 25 years. So I think what it was, and then look at how Putin ruthlessly took down, Lukoil under Khodorkovsky, and of course, I believe, killed Berezovsky in the UK. I don't believe there should be any question. The evidence, we always say, well, we don't have the evidence to prove that. Yeah, but we do. We know he killed Litvinenko. We know he tried to kill Skripal. Berezovsky hangs himself under mysterious circumstances. No, let's be honest. He was killed by Russian intelligence services. And so I think that was that period, after he came to power. And then there's the BBC investigation that was done about the apartment bombings. Let's not forget the key role. Putin was a controversial figure. He was made fun of on that Russian program. You and I remember that, Jonathan. Kukly.
By Viktor Shenderovich.
He hated it. Putin was really, really upset that there was an independent media. And for those listeners that don't know, there was a Muppet show on Russian TV, a satire. It was hugely popular in those early years of the 2000s, late 90s, when Putin came to power. He was made fun of. His character was very, very funny. And they pointed out all the ironies of, and Putin couldn't have that. We can't have ironies being pointed out. We can't have free press. We can't have any criticism. And so that was the period he clamped down. No independent press. Any journalists that dare make fun of him or dare point out when the Kursk disaster happened, there was still liberal critical media. and you remember some of those things that are unimaginable to happen now. Remember the woman shouting at him, the mother shouting at him, but then also remember what happened. Somebody snuck up and gave her an injection. That was a sign of the times to come. Can't have any opposition, can't have any debate. And so I think in those 5, 6, 7 year period you're talking about before that speech you mentioned, I think he was ruthlessly consolidating power until he got comfortable and said, okay, you know what, now we can turn abroad, now we can turn to those grievances. And this is important to look at Putin from the old dictator's handbook. He's a autocrat with grievances, and we haven't paid enough attention. Since 2008, too, remember he gave that famous speech where he was attacking the United States. I forget if it was at the Munich conference or
Munich Security Conference, 2007.
Yeah, exactly. It was 7. Okay, so he gave that speech attacking the world order that he believed the U.S. had sort of set up. That vein continues to today. I wanted to mention a quote from just 2 weeks ago. Andrei Bezrukov, who was mentioned in my book, he's one of the illegals that was stationed in the United States, Donald Heathfield. He was a failure as a spy. I point out some of his stupid, dumb tradecraft mistakes in my book, including he couldn't do clandestine meetings, walked for an hour and a half in Central Park with his buddy, one of the other illegals, sharing stories with each other. Like I said, the real illegals, the great illegals of the old day, Richard Zorga or Rudolph Abel, they'd be turning over in their graves. But he's heralded as a fantastic spy and a success. What did he say 2 weeks ago? He was asked by a Russian reporter at I think it was this St. Petersburg conference or one of those around there. He was asked, what about diplomacy in Ukraine? How do you feel? And he said in his typical guttural thugocracy type voice that he had, he said, "Diplomatia, не, нам это не нужно." He said, we don't need any diplomacy. And what he went on to say, which was really telling, is we're trying to destroy the world order that the United States and Europe set up. So no, they're not going to engage in diplomacy with us, and we don't need them for diplomacy either. He stated it right on the go. We want to destroy the world order that, the democratic liberal world order where rules order democracies, law-abiding democracies, that's what they're out to destroy. You're right. That started in the early 2000s, and then around 2008 was a turning point.
And of course, that gives the lie as well to negotiations. And this isn't just, the US that's maybe got caught up in illusory negotiations. It seems to be the whole of Europe is fixated on getting, let's say, a way out of this that will get them off the hook. We can all go back to normal. We can go back to, dare I say it, cuddly Russia of the 90s. Whereas what you're saying is that we are seeing more of the default setting. We're seeing the base operating system of the Russian intelligence services run imperial project to this point. And actually, we cannot look at the 90s as a template for anything. We have to deal with what it is and what we see now. That's the norm.
Yeah, well said, Jonathan. Very well said and well put. Thank you. Here's what's missing. We don't have any credible deterrent. Okay, that's absent right now. The next column piece I have coming out, hopefully it'll coincide with the release of your pod. It'll either be in my CIPHER Brief column or possibly one or two other outlets that I'm looking to publish in it right now. But here's the point that I'm making. A couple historical examples. Sometimes, as hard as it is for us in the West as democracies, we abhor war. Sometimes, unfortunately, we have to risk war and we have to risk escalation in order to prevent worse wars and worse escalation. And look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, October, President Kennedy had to risk war with the Soviet Union. He had to escalate. He put the naval blockade on Cuba, and he said, "We shall regard any missile launched by Cuba against the United States as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response." Mutual assured destruction. A lot of people at the time said, my God, what is Kennedy doing? Is he crazy? You are risking World War III, to quote another leader of our time. You are risking World War III. Of course he was. And he made a conscious decision as a responsible leader to say, I can't risk this level of escalation from the Soviet Union. We've got to get those missiles out of Cuba. In a similar vein, where's the resolve of Europe and the United States, my own country as well, standing against the aggression in Ukraine to say to Russia, you know what? Gloves are off. We're seizing the $300 billion in assets. This level of aggression, the largest land invasion since World War II, untold suffering of hundreds of thousands, millions of people in Ukraine. This is a generation of Ukrainians. You know, Jonathan, you've been there. This is a generation of Ukrainians that are going to be marked by war. Somewhere upwards of 40% of all their infrastructure is destroyed in that country. At what point do we say enough? Okay, they don't want to end the war. Let's seize the first $100 billion and assets and give them to Ukraine. Let's give long-range strike weapons to fight back and hit back and punch Putin in the nose for all the aggression in Europe, to say, you know what, you're going to have some of your operatives target our prime minister's property. You're going to try to kill the CEO of Rheinmetall. You're going to carry out cable cuts. You're going to do drone incursions into the Baltics and Poland. Okay, we're going to give long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine. This war will end very quickly, Jonathan, but we're afraid of the escalation. Really, in the West, we're afraid. We're playing out the playbook, unfortunately, from the 1930s, where the dictator gets to call the shots. And that's never going to work. That's never going to work.
That's it. I think it's a recurring conversation between Ben Hodges and myself, which is that we have ceded escalation dominance to Russia, and we continue to do so. The trouble is, after 4 years, that the next and the next and the next level of escalation is somewhat extraordinary. In fact, now I wanted to turn to sort of the internal mechanisms to help understand, this FSB class a little bit. And I think what we also struggle with, you've mentioned, certain grievance, you've mentioned actually certain ideological frameworks that come from the KGB culture, and certain elements of Russian imperialism, which have been, taken. And it all comes and builds up to a kind of collage. And yet we also see that the regime is extremely transactional, and actually many Russians are extremely transactional and direct when it comes down to it, and the intelligence services even more so. I think we have problems fitting all that together, and we see these as contradictions that couldn't possibly exist. So we always have these: is Putin this? Is he that? But that also means that, I'd love to hear your view. Does that also mean that we cannot formulate a strategic response to the regime?
Yeah, we can't fundamentally understand Russian policy today, Jonathan, and we can't understand how to counter it if we don't understand Putin, the thugocracy, the mafia-like culture of the security services. There was an excellent book just reviewed. I believe it came out of the Netherlands, and I can't recall the name, but maybe you'll help me find it. We could post a link for your listeners. It talks about. It's a study done, an academic book and study, but one that's well reviewed. It was either The Economist or maybe Foreign Policy Magazine reviewed it. And it's about how many allusions Putin has made to czarist traditions and the czarist autocracy. The Russian concept of vozhd. A vozhd in Russian, the most equivalent word is from German Führer, the all-encompassing ruler, the all-encompassing leader. I was shocked too when I read some excerpts from the book. It's thousands and thousands of references Putin has made in the past 26 years. Statues being put up all over Russia to czars. The reverence for Stalin, too. Stalin was a butcher. He murdered millions of his people. Soviets people understand that. My wife is Lithuanian. Her parents' generation, everyone knew what Stalin stood for. And you didn't have to be from Lithuania. My wife's half Russian and half Ukrainian as well, by the way. Quarter Ukrainian, quarter Russian, half Lithuanian. She's a good mix of Soviet peoples. Everybody knew it about Stalin. Nowadays, it's that reverence for autocracy for Stalin. Jonathan, if we don't understand how Putin thinks, if we don't understand the culture of this brutal culture, let me relate one anecdote. And this is an important one. Again, I mentioned in this upcoming column piece. Putin doesn't tell this story anymore, but early in his time, when he came into power, he used to like to tell a lot of stories, mythologizing his origin story. Some were about his early reverence as a boy for the stories about Sterlitz and the novels of Yulian Semyonov I mentioned in my book. Here's another story. Yeah, exactly. 17 Moments of Spring. Okay, here's another anecdote Putin liked to relate. It's about the rats in Leningrad after the war. Listen, Putin had legitimate suffering in his family. His father came back wounded very horribly in the war. His brother died of starvation early in the war in Leningrad. His mother almost died of starvation. There was horrible suffering in Leningrad. We know that. There's no excuse for what the Nazis, the Germans did to the Soviet people. At the same time, Putin doesn't mention Stalin's role in that. The food warehouses, it was the NKVD that put all the food together in centralized locations because they didn't want people to have it, and the Nazis destroyed those warehouses. So any fault of the Soviet regime and Stalin's glossed over. But let's tell the story of the rats. Putin tells the story that as a young boy, he was confronted with rats in the apartment dwellings complexes. Putin comments one rat in particular, there would be the alpha rat. And Putin learned very quickly if you didn't kick or punch that rat right in the nose, the rat was just going to bite you, it was going to go after you. So that's Putin's worldview. That's what he told that story for a reason. Once people understand, I got to deal with a rat bully, you punch him or kick him in the nose. That's his worldview. That's his origin story. When are we going to punch him, the big rat in the nose? When are we going to decide finally, you know what? Aggression has costs. Otherwise, the rat is enabled. His own story. I think it's telling. And we just, again, like you said, Jonathan, we constantly want to treat him as a rational world actor. Surely he wants to end this war. And if we offer a certain number of real estate deals in Siberia, then he's going to agree, right? No, he's a rat that needs to be punched in the nose.
As Ukrainians put it, and they'll refer to him as a gopnik, a classic kind of Odessa gopnik. Again, how do you make that go away? Like a petty thief, you punch them until they leave you alone. Uh, how far then can we understand the sort of current FSB structure? How did it rename itself, reorganize itself? But also, crucially, what are its funding models? Because we've got this curious mixture, as you say, of ideology, ambition, expansion, but also we have something of the criminal mindset of the 1990s, maybe fused with something traditional from Ivan the Terrible's time, which is called KREMLIN, which is essentially you allow certain, people within your hierarchy to essentially go out and thieve. You give them license to thieve and to farm certain parts of the economy. So how can we understand the criminal element that has been fused with the modern FSB?
Yeah, good question. I want to mention Kevin Rila, my friend who lives there in the UK from Brunel University. He wrote the definitive volume, FSB: A Concise History, with Georgetown Press, and I cite it frequently in my own book. The most corrupt elements within the FSB, Jonathan, ironically enough, are the economic, the department in charge of the economic, crimes, financial crimes. It's the most corrupt within the FSB. It's where FSB officers want to work, by the way, because they know that's where you go to line your pockets. Pretty simple principle. They go up to companies at every level and they say, has anybody hit you up yet? It's very mafia-like. You paying protection anybody? If not, you're paying protection to me. And that's how the racket works. And then up the chain of command in the FSB, it's a very much a feudal. Russians have another word for it. They call it konstva. From the concept of the Khan in Central Asia. It's a konstva. It's the feudal system. You pay the chieftain above you. The next chieftain gets money from him all the way up the feudal chain, all the way to Putin at the very top. And that's the organizing principle of the FSB. I can't tell you how many stories I have over my career debriefing Russian intelligence officers. Jonathan, thank you for being an astute reader. I mentioned them throughout the book. This is a constant obsession. Rackets, schemes, scamming. Got to make money. I got to take care of myself. But not only me, I got to take care of the boss above me. I got to buy 40 iPhones when I'm supposed to only have 20 because 20 of them I got to send back to the center. I got to get 15 laptops because 5 of them I got to give to my boss for him and his family. His kids need laptops. At larger levels, I give that example from the Iraq war of scheming sanctions, buy an entire tank of gasoline for the embassy vehicles, and then they take it across the border. They sell it in Syria. A friend of mine is an early reader in the book. This is an example how we don't get it in the West. I said they sold the tanker, as this Russian intelligence officer related. Typical story. They do it with Iran, Iraq, any country they have where they can get away with this. They sell that at less than market prices in order take everything as profit. My CIA colleague that was reading, he said, I think this is a typo. You mean at higher than market prices to make? I said, no, you're missing the whole point. The entire tanker is profit. The entire thing is profit. He's like, oh, yeah, it hadn't occurred to me. I didn't even think about that because we don't think that way. That's fundamentally part of the problem, Jonathan, to your question. We don't think the way they do. We don't think of the corruption at every level embedded across the system. But they do. That's how it's set up. And nobody in Russia is surprised by this. They know this is how it works. This is what they're dealing with. They dealt with it in Soviet times. It's just been refined to a new level today with the FSB.
And in terms of punching back, this is where I think it gets interesting. Has Putin built himself a kind of tupik or a cul-de-sac? Because ordinarily, in the mechanism you describe, all we would have to do is to make the war unprofitable, not just for Putin, but for everyone in that whole chain. Make it unprofitable for them to continue war, and then they would reconsider. But it seems that he's painted himself into something of a corner. He can no longer just end the war. He can no longer transition back to a civilian economy. He can no longer bring, 1 million soldiers back with all their psychological conditions, and some of them perhaps infused with nationalist ideas. Where are we in terms of stopping Putin?
Yeah, very good question, Jonathan. I have a piece coming out for Proceedings Magazine, the Journal of the United States Navy. It'll be published in July. I write about this exact issue. Putin has they have a lot of societal problems from the war, part of Russia today, and then after the war, taking care of those, millions of veterans now, dealing with the families of, hundreds of thousands of dead. But fundamentally, I believe that they're gonna turn to what's worked for 26 years. It's the repression. Look at what they're doing now, taking away the freedoms of Telegram. It's an app that threatens them because the youth of Russia like to use it, and they don't have total control of it, even though they have controls of the ISPs and all the phone companies across Russia, and they have for over 20 years. Russian law was set up that way, so FSB officers are stationed in those companies. But Telegram is a threat. And so fundamentally, even though these are pointed out as weaknesses, I believe that what the overriding principle, what Russia has learned and what Russia has shown in 4 years of war, they've shown that security services can be strengthened in wartime, unfortunately. I wrote an article for the CIPHER Brief talking about what Iran probably has learned from Russia. That was one of the big 3 points I made. I think Iran has learned, we can be resilient. We can strengthen our hold over our people in wartime. That's what Russia has shown by and large over the past 4 years. So they face tremendous societal problems, Jonathan, but unfortunately, I think their roadmap is going to be turning to even stronger controls by the security services on their people.
In which case, a catastrophic, from the Russian perspective, defeat in war maybe is the only thing that would break that financial and psychological chain. Not that actually, I think many Western countries have really internalized the idea that Russian defeat is the only way out of it. Is part of the problem here that we tend to look at the Russian intelligence services as if they were equivalents to, Western versions, MI6, CIA, etc.
Yeah, this is a big problem. I comment on this a lot in my media appearances. We hear folks say, even I've had journalists, when I warn them, they'll still introduce a question. Thank you for, Jonathan, you phrased it the right way. I'll have a lot of journalists say, now, Sean, can you go through for me? Isn't the FSB the equivalent of MI5 or the FBI? No equivalence whatsoever. We again, it's fundamental misunderstanding.
First like of all, saying the SS and the FBI, aren't they the same? I mean,
no,
really?
Exactly. No, that's exactly the reference to make, Jonathan. I had that anecdote in my book. Remember when an FSB officer said, "Let's drink to Dzerzhinsky," and I said, "Are we going to drink to Reichsfuhrer SS Himmler next? Because I'm not going to do that." He's like, "How dare you? How could you possibly point out the head of the Nazi SS?" I said, "Because that's what you're doing. Dzerzhinsky was responsible for hundreds of thousands of dead. The NKVD for millions of dead." I said, "No, I'm not going to drink to that horrible, disgusting, brutal bastard that he was, Dzerzhinsky, and that's why they hate me. They hate me as much as I hate and despise the Russian security services." But to your point, let's look at just size alone. The FSB is a vast bureaucracy. Again, I mentioned Kevin Reela's book. Go look at, prior to the war, between upwards of 350, 400,000 officers across Russia, including 200,000 border guards. In wartime, I believe these bureaucracies only grow. And so I believe it's probably approaching half a million officers from the FSB today, totally controlling Russian society and state. I believe it's a total surveillance state. I believe only China today can rival them in terms of capabilities. Jonathan, every single phone, every phone that a Russian holds is a personal beacon that they carry with them all across Russia. And the FSB are some of the best in the world. Their Center 16 is some of the very best at cyber signals and technical operations. And so I think that, they're not bounded by any laws too. So to the point about analogies, they're not MI5 or FBI that has to get warrants. They are the warrants. They get whatever they want, whenever they want it. They don't have to ask permission. And so that makes them a formidable adversary, despite all their weaknesses, failings, shortcomings, incompetence, corruption. All of those things are also true. I've had people ask me about my book. Well, you point out a lot of their failings. They're not 10 feet tall. Edward Lucas, the journalist, is a friend of yours, and he's been very gracious to me, reviewing my book twice, very nicely, favorably. He got it. He mentioned in his review he wrote for Foreign Policy magazine, they're not 10 feet tall. We need to go after them. We need to attack them as a soft target. At the same time, they're formidable because they get continually restored by the state. They get all the resources they need from Putin, and they have no accountability. So when you have no accountability for your failures, Jonathan, that makes them formidable adversaries we have to stay focused on.
If they've consolidated their power in wartime, and let's face it, war has been very good for some people, not just the Siloviki. There's a whole class of middle managers in Moscow who've doubled, trebled their salaries, and despite all the economic problems, are likely better off than they were before, given that quite a few of their colleagues fled westwards, and a lot of people have cleaned up, those that have stayed behind. But one of the things I think we also really have a problem with is understanding that in some senses these Siloviki, their internal rivalries and competitions. Even I struggle to get not even I, especially I struggle to get my head around this. FSB, SVR, GRU, or even that elite, close protection detail, the FSO, which are implicated in the recent sort of shutdowns of, internet and certain mobile apps in the center of Moscow, St. Petersburg. How would you describe this sort of competition versus cooperation between them?
Yeah, so they are all trying to get in the limelight. This is another thing where Stalin's lieutenants, the way Stalin sort of let his lieutenants fight for and jockey for power, Putin does a similar thing. The Siloviki, some of them are always a little higher in the hierarchy, and then they're knocked down a notch or two, like Naryshkin was back in 2022. Come on, speak plainly, Sergei. What's wrong? I think Putin always has had a little bit of a dislike for the Pegeuchniki, as they call them, the first chief directorate guys from the KGB days. Even though Putin was part of that when he served abroad as well in Dresden, he was director of the FSB. So he likes to embarrass Naryshkin here and there. Then again, he elevates him, gives him a reward, like just last week, right? He was put in charge of along with Stepashin, a former FSB director. Naryshkin was elevated in charge of head of all publications in Russia. Everything that's put out in book or media print, everything, those two are in charge. Again, the organizing principle of the state. You got an SVR director and a former head of the FSB are put in charge of all book publications in Russia, the committee that oversees and is in charge of that. It's very much akin to the Third Reich. Goebbels couldn't imagine the power that the FSB and the Siloviki have now in today's Russia. But I think that in terms of rumors of his weakness, let's just talk about really quickly who does surround Putin. In 2016, Jonathan, he took those elite Kremlin Guard units of the Ministry of Interior, groups like OMON and others, and he put them under the control of Rosgvardia, 300,000 some strong, and Zolotov, a former KGB hardliner, Silovik, he put in charge. Fiercely loyal to Putin. Why? Because he takes care of them. All of them, all the leaders, they get their golden palaces around Moscow, quite literally. They're taken care of. They get the best equipment. And he only reinforced those units after the Prigozhin aborted mutiny. By the way, why did Prigozhin stop before he got to Moscow? He knew he had no chance. He had 30,000 strong. He was going to come up against 300,000 from Rosgvardia. And then Putin's FSO that he mentioned, the Federal Protective Service, that's 30,000 alone. And those are ruthless killers like Krasikov, his former bodyguard that went to Germany and in broad daylight executed a Chechen in broad daylight and was immediately captured by the Germans, and Putin got him out 5 years later. It's hard to confront that level of loyalty. These are people entirely beholden to Putin. And then the FSB, of course, as we talked about, hundreds of thousands of officers and leadership that are completely loyal and beholden to the dictator. It's a formidable system. Putin set it up because he was nervous and very concerned about the color revolutions, concerned when he saw Gaddafi outed and then killed, concerned when he saw Saddam Hussein hanging, literally, for justice. So he learned to set up a ruthless security state that protects him very well.
Now, I could fire questions at you for hour after hour. I know that's not possible. So let's sort of wrap up with the last one here. And I think we've talked a lot about what is similar to the Soviet period, what has come through in terms of the KGB cult, mystique, practice, etc. We've talked a bit about how it's fused with a certain mafia transactionalism and the limits on power and accumulation of wealth have been lifted, limits that would have been there in the Soviet Union. But what is new? What is innovative in Russian intelligence? For instance, digital disinformation, the change in their risk tolerance for operations, their outsourcing in terms of sabotage, etc. That, to my mind, is a huge threat, a far greater threat than the nuclear threat. So what's new or what's innovative that we should be watching out for?
Well, Jonathan, we discussed the level of recklessness being new, the services being unbounded, run amok, as I mentioned in the piece too, put out by The Sun there in the UK, and appreciated them, quoting me in that, reporting my analysis. That is new, that level, lack of accountability. But here's what I believe is the fundamental The biggest threat to our democracies in the West is cognitive warfare by the Russian intelligence services and also their Chinese allies. The fact that on the internet today, somewhere between 20 to 40% of all the content is AI generated. That's what experts say. Folks a lot smarter than I am. So in that environment, and that's growing every day, literally week by week, you have the FSB and the other Russian intelligence services. The SVR has an entire directorate for measures of support devoted towards information warfare, thousands of officers. When they meddled in our election in 2016, Jonathan, and they meddled in Brexit in the UK, and both of those were documented in reports that were nonpartisan in the UK, in the United States. We had the DNI report and we had the SSCI report. I always like to point out where Marco Rubio, current Secretary of State, was chair of that committee of SSCI. He agreed with the findings. They meddled in the election. Fundamentally, I believe not for or against any one single candidate, but against all of democracy. That's the big prey. That's the big hunting game that they're after. So now remember, though, here's the contrast. 10 years ago, remember, those were human actors carrying out those attacks. Prigozhin's Internet Research Agency he set up in St. Petersburg to help the intelligence services, those were intelligence officers and criminal organized crime proxies. And they were given quotas. You have to do 200 social media posts today. We want you arguing abortion's rights. Argue both sides, by the way. That's what Facebook pointed out in their report. That's what we know for a fact. They argued both sides of the issues. And now here's the really important point, Jonathan. What they did 10 years ago, people had to do. Now programs can do. Now cognitive warfare, software programs can be written, and they just write out the prompt and they say to AI, do it. Ding, enter button. Unfortunately, it literally is that simple, and that's the monumental threat we face. I see it in my own reporting. One of my media appearances that has 200K right now, 200,000 views on YouTube. I'm honored by that. But the Russian trolling, Jonathan, it's amazing. I don't mind what the occasional Russian troll that comes in and says, Vladimir Putin is great, man. We get that. That's easy to see. What's the much more nefarious trolling is when I see Russians, and I know they're Russians. I can just see their approach. Because a lot of the comments will be nice and complimentary, and then I'll be hit with a Russian wave of the trolling. The more sinister ones are where they allege that I was political, because I'm apolitical in everything I say. You can hear that in this podcast today. I don't get into domestic politics in the US or the UK. It's not my business. I'm not a politician. I'm focused on the adversary. But where it's really insidious is they will say, see, he's anti-MAGA. He's anti-Trump. Or see, he's for this politician or that politician. I didn't say that at all. Nothing further from the truth. That is cognitive warfare. That is trying to get Americans to discount what I say about our adversaries, trying to say, oh, he's got a political agenda, even though I didn't say anything about politics at all. So that's the danger, Jonathan, and that's being played out. I see it, in my own small, magnifying glass way, but in the larger societal attacks that the Russians and Chinese are carrying out across our societies, that's the danger. That's what they're doing.
And that's the ancient, Russian mechanic of imperialism as well, which is divide and conquer, divide and conquer, divide and conquer. Keep going until your adversaries are fighting each other, doing the dirty work for you. But as you say, they're able to do that in the digital sphere in a way that wasn't possible before.
That's right. That's right. Unfortunately, I believe it's the existential threat to our democracies. We have to get a handle on their information warfare, what they call active measures. Now they call measures of support, and the Chinese are very, very good at it too. When I speak to university groups, by the way, Jonathan, I mentioned in the UK, I mentioned here in the US, I talk to universities a lot. I tell the youth, you're the target. The Russians and Chinese want you to believe democracy doesn't work. In their cynical worldview, there are no such things as free and fair elections. You got to trust the big leader, the Vozhd in Russia, Putin, or Xi Jinping in China. Better that he decide. He knows better than me. That's what they want. That's what their societies are founded on. So their attacks to our democracies in the West, fundamentally, they want to go after our youth especially. They want them to believe, I can't trust these Venezuelan voting machines in the United States. I can't trust those. Former Attorney General Barr said himself, he was appointed by our current president. It's bullshit. There's nothing to that. His exact words. His words is bullshit. But they keep those myths. The Russians keep them going, and the Chinese keep them going, so that Americans think, geez, I don't know who to trust nowadays. That's it. That's exactly what they want. So that is, I believe it's the biggest crisis we face long-term, Jonathan.
John, that makes the work you're doing so incredibly important. And again, here's an endorsement once more. If people want to understand how they're being manipulated, why they're being targeted, how to push back, then I think your book is a foundational piece of understanding that people need to have. So I'm so glad to see you get so many interviews, so much traction, because this is, as you say, one of the most important things we can do today is to understand this pushback and, in some ways, rebuild trust in our values.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. A couple thank yous. Thank you to Naval Institute Press for publishing my book, having the courage to publish a book, targeting our adversaries and standing by me in the mission, all those followers, supporters that have helped me. I believe fundamentally that when we give an unbiased, apolitical, evidence-based approach to our adversaries, it resonates with people. It's been resonating in the UK. I was honored by the welcome that I was given there. Appreciated you coming to my talk again, Jonathan. Appreciate what you do with your podcast and all of your work. Many others out there. We mentioned Ed Lucas. He's doing heroic work. We have to fight back, and we fight back with truth. We fight back as democracies, and that's our strength. Our ideal will win out in the end. That's why I believe it will always win against Russian intelligence. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about things I'm passionate about, Jonathan. I appreciate your support.
Thank you. And hopefully look forward to another opportunity.
I love it. Thank you.
Right. Let's find the pause button and start recording.
Khartia is a Ukrainian corps operating around Kupiansk, which is a critical area of the front. Now, this campaign won't be for everybody. It is a kinetic campaign in that we are crowdsourcing here for funds to buy vampire drones. 15, in fact. 5 of those have already been achieved in this campaign, but we are looking to scale this up to get the full amount of $40,000 US. That's going to Jigger's Paw that are handling this. This is an incredibly important campaign. There are many creators who are taking part in this. My view is that it's not enough at this point just to help Ukraine to survive. It's not enough just to invest in humanitarian causes. Not everyone's going to be comfortable with this, but they have to remove the invaders from their lands. To do that, they need the skills, the munitions, the weaponry to achieve that. This is where these vampire drones come in. So please, this isn't a full polished promo. I'm still working on that, but the campaign launches today. Please do check it out and, of course, help in any way that you can.